Yep. Right.
Got to pause it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Tom Chevry, and along with Patty Zimmerman, I am co-director of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. So it was only a year ago, just about a year ago, that we had to close down the Embodied Festival. We went online with 3 exhibitions. So we're back. So welcome to the 24th edition of the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival. We're very happy to be back. It's been a big year. Lots happened since last year when we shuttered the festival. COVID, protests on racial inequities, masks, vaccines, remote learning, the end of Donald Trump, the Zoomiverse, the yearning for connections around ideas and community. Yes, it's been quite a year. So this year, for the first time in 24 years, we are 100% virtual. So we have 2 FLEFF mottos this year. FLEFF, a different environment, and we are the screen. Both of these were developed by our festival producers, Ann Michelle and Phil Wild, and we appreciate their input for that. We will be doing some short introductions to save time for dialogue. During the event, we ask you to use the chat we will be using the chat for extended bios, links and references related to tonight's presentations. Participants can use the chat for questions or for comments as they think of them. So at the end of this suggestion, we ask that all of you unmute your microphones for just a bit, put on your video screens if you don't have them on, and then we'll applaud for our presenters. So keep that in mind for the end of tonight's session. So for tonight, it's my great pleasure to introduce Leah Schaefer, who is from Hobart William Smith Colleges, which just turns out to be my alma mater as well. And she's in the Media and Society Department, and a longtime FLEFF collaborator and a good friend to all of us. So she will be introducing tonight's conversation between Iskandar Zulkarnain and Enrique Gonzalez Conty, Conversations Across Screen Culture. So this is a collaboration tonight. So I'll turn things over to Leah. Take it away, Leah.
Thanks, Tom. I want to welcome everyone back to Conversations Across Screen Cultures. We are thrilled to be joining with FLEFF tonight in our 2nd season of events. Conversations Across Screen Cultures features conversations between screen studies scholars in the Central New York region. It is sponsored by Screen Studies faculty from Hobart and William Smith Colleges and Ithaca College, as well as the Cine con Cultura Film Festival, the Finger Lakes Environmental Film Festival, and the Syracuse University Human Rights Film Festival. We welcome all faculty, undergraduate and graduate students, alums, Central New York Screen Studies scholars, and other guests to our event this evening. We want to acknowledge that here in upstate New York, we occupy the stolen land of the Cayuga people and the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. We give honor to them and recognize that Indigenous and Natives peoples and their movements are alive today and affirm our continued commitment to supporting Indigenous resistance. We recognize that we are in a settler colonial space and that we are occupying what is not ours. This statement serves as a way to honor the indigenous and native peoples who were displaced by genocide and that continue to fight to reclaim their lands and sacred places. I am Dr. Leah Schaefer, and I am going to be the MC this evening. I'm going to introduce our conversationalists and describe the structure of how our event will run. Our featured guest today is Dr. Iskandar Zulkarnain, and our interviewer is Dr. Enrique Gonzalez Conty. Dr. Zulkarnain, Izul, is a visiting assistant professor in media and society at Hobart and William Smith Colleges. He researches and teaches in the area of global digital cultures and transnational media studies, focusing on Southeast Asian emergent and popular cultures, global video games, and animation cultures. His work appears in journals including Sojourn, Journal of Social Issues in Southeast Asia, and Afterimage, and edited collections such as On and Off the Page, Mapping Place in Text and Culture, and Feminist Interventions in Participatory Media. He is currently preparing a manuscript about the phenomenon of internet buzzers in Indonesia as a mistranslation of the global internet influencer cultures. He is also one of the co-founders of an interinstitutional initiative, the Global Digital Humanities Working Group, with a grant from the Central New York Humanities Corridor and Mellon Foundation. That initiative aims to invite critical conversation and reflection on issues that will broaden the reach of digital humanities research and practice, such as identity construction in global algorithmic cultures. Dr. Enrique Gonzalez Conty is an assistant professor of Spanish in the Department of Modern Language and Literature at Ithaca College. He was the 2013-14 Pre-Doctoral Diversity Fellow at this same institution. He earned his PhD in Hispanic Literature in 2014 from the University of Texas at Austin. His current book project, Archiving the Revolution, Claiming History in Cuban Literature and Film, examines the close relationship between post-revolutionary Cuban literature and film and its ties to important Cuban states institutions such as Casa de las Americas and the Cuban Film Institute. His research appears in top peer-reviewed journals, including the Puerto Rican Studies Centro Journal and Black Camera, a film journal published by Indiana University Press. So let's give them a welcome. Our format for this evening is this. We will begin with a 20 to 25 minute conversation between this evening's featured screen scholars. Then we will open to discussion from participants. Our theme is conversations, so we ask you to talk with us. We have been working it so that folks will raise their hand and bring their thoughts to the floor, though tonight we have a large group. So if you have things in the chat, we will attend to those things in addition to hand raising. After we do our Q&A, we like to finish up with takeaways, which is a moment when we ask folks to share their thoughts about ideas that have been generated in the session. The event will end at 8 o'clock. From 8 to 8:15, we hold a sobremesa, an after-event social gathering where folks are invited to linger and chat about the ideas raised in our conversations this evening. We want to let you know there are 2 conversations across Screen Cultures events coming up. We will be speaking with and learning about Nicole Horsley on April 3rd and Monica Mehta on April 22nd. We're so glad you could join us, and we want to invite you to turn on your mics, and turn on your cameras at the end with applause before we head into our sobremesa. So thanks for listening to me, and I will turn it over now to our conversation.
Thank you, Leah, and welcome everyone. So tonight, Izul, I wanted to start our conversation asking you about your personal career first. And so the first questions that I have for you have to do about how did you arrive at doing research about global digital cultures and Southeast Asian new media cultures. So that's my first question. But a similar question also has to do with how you ended up deciding about doing research about this, and also where did you go to do your undergraduate and graduate studies?
Thank you, Enrique. And thank you for the Conversation Across Screen Cultures organizer, as well as the FLEFF organizers for inviting me tonight. And thank you everyone for coming. So I guess the short answer to your question is that I focus on this career research trajectory because I'm deeply interested in considering how affordances as well as constraints generated by unequal access to media technologies have shaped and are being shaped by the respective the everyday lives of their respective users. So, and I have kind of like a personal motivation because I came from a global South country. I came from Indonesia. So, and Indonesia is digital infrastructure in Indonesia is pretty much still widely scattered unequally. And so that's sort of like one, sort of like the first kind of like maybe the first thing that sort of motivates me in doing research about global digital culture and also Southeast Asian new media cultures. And I have sort of a formative experiences that sort of led me to this kind of career. So actually, before before I did college studies, I actually wanted to become an electronic engineer up until high school. So I didn't really have any idea that I will end up like this. So, but then I ended up actually not taking engineering studies during college, but actually I studied English literature. And so English literature, and and I have a foolish reason for that because I was involved in Indonesian punk underground culture, and I wanted to write a good English lyrics because at the time, pretty much most Indonesian punk bands, they wrote their lyrics in English as a kind of resistance toward Indonesian like mainstream music industry, and also to sort of like orient themselves as a kind of being part of transnational underground community. So that's sort of like how I did my undergrad studies. And then in English literature, I was introduced with critical theory. So critical theories, and particularly post-colonial theories from like scholars like Spivak, Gati Spivak, and Edward Said, Homi Bhabha. So I became interested in critical theories, and especially post-colonial theories. And during my college years, there's also a really influential experience, which is the 1998 Reformation period in Indonesia. So in 1998, that's when mass student demonstration essentially led to the fall of the Suharto's military regime. So I was part of that kind of like mass demonstration, mass protest, and that kind of experience that sort of like shapes the way I see the way I think about like counter movement, like activism, etc. And at the same time, I also see the kind of dark side of this Reformation event because on the other hand, I see that there are two kind of like trajectory in Indonesian Reformation history. So the first one is the kind of like progressive student movement that toppled Suharto's regime. But during that same time, there's also cases of riots and especially violence against the ethnic Chinese in Indonesia. So ethnic Chinese is essentially considered as the kind of like second-class citizen in Indonesia, pretty much. So that, and this history tends to get buried under this glorification of a Reformation period. So that tension there also makes me think critically about this like activism, student activism, and activism in general. And then after I graduated from college, I was lucky to work with Joshua Oppenheimer, who is the director of The Act of Killing and The Look of Silence. So he was hired at the time to make a documentary about the effect of globalization from the perspective of a plantation worker in North Sumatra. So I was part of his film crew. And I think that he was influenced by a third cinema movement or third cinema approach, that instead of making a traditional documentary, we actually collaborated with the plantation workers to make the documentary. So we trained them how to shoot, how to make films, essentially. And that's when I sort of like witnessed how the notion of access is really important, because I see how there's this one plantation worker, like he never touched video camera in his life up until that point. And then when he first learned how to use camera, he actually showed like a really high level of sensitivity of cinematography. So I was kind of like surprised, and Josh was also surprised with that kind of like with that experience. So that's sort of like makes me think about the question of access, that sort of really important in terms of like this media circulation. And so with that, I then come back to teach in my alma mater, and then I applied for a scholarship, and I was also lucky to get a Fulbright scholarship. So I came to the US. I studied a master's in English literature still at Florida State University. And there, my advisor is sort of post-colonial media scholars. And he introduced me with all these theories and also like case studies. And at first actually I wanted to write a thesis about punk movement in Indonesia. But then I was introduced to this digital activism. I don't know if you've heard about this collective, hacktivist collective, the Electronic Disturbance Theater, led by Ricardo Dominguez. I think he is at UC San Diego right now. So this Electronic Disturbance Theater is sort of, they did this thing called electronic virtual sit-in as a form of a digital protest or digital activism, and I was really into that. So then I switched gear to writing my thesis about this collective, and then I also learned that in Indonesia there is this open source software activism as well, as a kind of challenging the dominance of Microsoft as a global software producer. So this open source software movement in Indonesia become a comparative analysis for me in my master's thesis. And with that, I continued my study at the University of Rochester. So there I focus on focusing on digital culture in Indonesia. I started with this open source software activism. And the more I study them, the more I see that there is this kind of nationalistic sentiment in this open source software movement. So then I frame my dissertation project as to look at these cases of digital nationalistic practice in Indonesia. So I look at 3 case studies. I look at the open source software movement, and then I look at a nationalistic video game production, and I also look at a nationalistic social media activism or event, that they call digital flag hoisting ceremony or digital flag raising ceremony to sort of commemorate Indonesian independence. So that's how I become interested. That's how I focus my career in this field of global digital cultures and Southeast Asia emerging new media cultures.
Thank you, Isul. So thinking about your work in post-colonial theory, I wanted to ask you if you could define briefly what you mean by post-colonial media studies as one of your research areas. And you know, I have a lot of questions, so you don't have to answer, you know, the whole history of this area, but I wanted to focus on the post-colonial term, because I think it has a lot to do with the other questions that I have for you about how is that related to video games.
Right. So my understanding about post-colonial media studies or post-colonial media history is this sort of like a framework that tried to resist or challenge the kind of universalizing tendency in thinking about media studies or in thinking about media, the history of media, usually from a Eurocentric perspective. And in this case, usually they will frame it as a kind of like idealized history of media. And so the post-colonial media history or post-colonial media perspective here is sort of like this awareness that in many parts of the world, access to media is pretty much still unequal. And also the history of media from a global perspective is frequently related with the history of colonialism. So I have several examples of scholarship that I sort of like aligned to. So for instance, Nicole Starosialski's work in Undersea Cable Network, where she sort of looks at the internet undersea cable network that always blow my students' mind whenever I explain that the internet is actually this undersea cable network. They always think like it's Wi-Fi, it's up like satellite. So when I told them that no, actually 99% of internet traffic comes from undersea, and they was like, what? Wow. And so and in this case, Starosialski in her work actually looks at how this network is actually pretty much overlaid on top of the network of telegraph. That's like the old media. And the network of telegraph is pretty much related with the history of colonialism and in how like they use telegraph to communicate between the colonial metropoles with their peripheral colonies. So that kind of history, that kind of media studies, that's the one that I'm interested in. That's what I think as a kind of like post-colonial media history or post-colonial media studies. And in the context of Indonesia, there's also a work by Rudolf Mrazek that looks at media in its broadest sense of the term in relation to the history of the Dutch colonialism in Indonesia and also the struggle for independence. So one of the chapter looks at the history of radio in relation to this like nationalist movement in Indonesia, also how the Dutch sort of control radio broadcast pretty much to sort of like have this colonial rule. So that's what I mean by post-colonial media studies or post-colonial media history.
Thank you. And so I also wanted to ask you about not only the relationship between video games and national identity, which you mentioned as part of your master's and later on your dissertation research. You know, what is the relationship between video games and national identity, and also maybe think a little bit about what you've been focusing on when you are thinking about decolonizing video games. So if you could link those two questions together.
Yes, so maybe I'll start with the decolonizing video games first, because that's sort of like the term that that is articulated by this emerging scholars in video games, particularly in this edited collection by Philip Phoenix Tatsens called the Video Games and the Global South. And so they sort of like believe that the history of global video games and the industry of global video game tend to sort of like focus to this kind of Eurocentric or wealthy countries or the conventional centers of video games like Japan or South Korea, and they tend to neglect the gaming cultures in the global South, which is pretty much larger. It's kind of like pretty much huge parts of the globe in this case. So they so in the chapter, in his introduction, Phoenix Tatsen want us to think about how to decolonize video games, in thinking about video games not only just kind of a purely capitalistic entertainment medium, but also something that can be used as a kind of platforms for resistance, as also a kind of platforms that can represent voices from below, basically represent the subaltern, the notion of subaltern here. And I'm actually teaching global video games culture. So this is part of our session, our section in my class. And I think my students, some of them are here. So there is one game, can I share it? So this is a game that we discussed in my class. So this is a game created by Elizabeth Lapensi, and she's indigenous video game developer and also artist, and it's called Thunderbird Strike. And this game is actually part of her participation in a protest against the Dakota pipeline. And in this game, you are playing as this Thunderbird, which represents what she calls a kind of like post-human entity from an indigenous perspective. And here, it's really interesting because the game actually doesn't have a losing condition. You always win. But the idea here is actually to kind of like come to a realization that oil pollution is part of our reality. And so from the indigenous perspective, this oil needs to be thought of as this non-human entity that should be balanced by humans. So it's not just trying to, it's kind of like a different way to think about from the kind of dystopian perspective that we're all gonna die and then this, but in this case, the game sort of like teaches us in how to create balance out of this condition from an indigenous perspective. So that's sort of like an example of decolonizing video games. So like to use video games as a kind of platform to represent voices from below, to represent oppressed voices. And in my own case, I look at, as I mentioned, I look at Nusantara Online, and in this case, I'm actually not glorifying Nusantara Online, but I'm actually I'm actually critical about their project, because their project is a nationalistic project, and I have sort of like, I have a distinct perspective about Indonesian nationalism, and also their expression of nationalism in this case. So, but I want to think of the Nusantara Online in two ways here. So on one hand, their project is part of, again, this counter history or counter action in relation to the dominance of the mainstream video game culture from the West, from the kind of like established market. So they wanted to create their own game that represent their own history, in this case, their own national history. So that's one way to to see this project. But on the other hand, when I look at their project, when I study their project, and I actually interviewed the developer. So let me just share the screen to show. So they actually have a really serious motivation in creating this game. And they went to the archaeological site to try to represent Indonesian artifact like accurately. Like for instance, this is based on their research. They went to Trowulan archaeological site, which is the site about one of pre-colonial Indonesian kingdom, Majapahit. So they want to represent this pre-colonial Indonesian kingdom in their game. So that notion of historical accuracy, or like simulation, accurate simulation, trying to portray their nation, in this case in a digital format, as accurate as possible, as part of their nationalistic ideology. But when I play the game, I find this. So I circle this, and this is an animation, but this is basically an explanation of race classification. So there is a classification of race, and in this case, this is an explanation for the white Caucasian race. And in this case, their explanation is that white Caucasian race, the most balanced race in terms of physics and intelligence, always ready with the most difficult situation, strong and intelligent human, famous as a rational race. So like I just immediately like, what? Like how come you have this kind of like nationalistic game project, but you have this kind of like really Eurocentric racial classification? So that kind of like discrepancies, that's what I'm interested in like thinking about this project as part of this video games and national identity. So I hope that answers your question, Enrique.
Thank you, Sul. And since we only have a couple of minutes before we open up the floor to other questions, I wanted to shift and ask you about your pedagogical approaches. How do you teach video games? You already talked a little bit about this, but I also wanted you to to explain what you mean by digital nationalism, which I think is also important in your research.
Mhm.
And, thinking about, we were thinking about post-colonial issues, but also, how nationalism has turned into a digital nationalism today. A lot of people expressing and video games being part of that question, right?
Mhm.
So I know that you have published about your teaching strategy. So if you could talk a little bit about what you do in the classroom briefly. And then the last question that I have for you is, where do you see your research area headed in the future?
Okay, yeah, so I think I'm going to start with the digital nationalism first. So my formulation of digital nationalism is a kind of a new mode of imagining, in this case, in my case, Indonesia as a national entity through the mediation of digital platforms. So that's how I define digital nationalism, and I think it's really interesting because with as um, as Tom mentioned, now we're in the era of, we're sort of stuck with the era of Zoom with all this digital like immateriality. So somehow thinking about digital nationalism is not necessarily uh, strange anymore in a sense. But at the time when I was thinking, when I was doing this research, it's it's sort of like really new in a way, like how these Indonesian actors try to think about nationalism. And and then in terms of how I teach, how I teach it in class, and I think um, here it's in relation to my work with Dr. Leah Schaefer. So I taught Intro to Media Studies course at HWS, and then we studied about we studied about game, and I also asked them. We at one point, this was during the heyday, the height of Pokemon Go. Anyone familiar with Pokemon Go? So that's when I asked them to play Pokemon Go as a kind of augmented reality game, and we explored the notion of virtual reality and also augmented reality, immediacy and hypermediacy, because in virtual reality you essentially are immersed in this kind of like digital environment that you're sort of like it's kind of like immediate and sensation. But with augmented reality you sort of like uh, be in this kind of like in between space, like in between space of hypermediacy, where you see the layer, the digital layer, but you also see the real kind of space. So that kind of sense of hypermediacy, that's the one that we explore in my class. And uh, and then I assigned them this short article about playing Pokemon Go while being Black. And that's when the notion of race, ethnicity, class becomes highlighted here. Because and this is also based on my own experience playing a couple of augmented reality games. Like I tend to um, play on campus or in like around my house, around my apartment, because if I explore uh, areas that I'm not familiar with, then I can see how like people look at me from the window. And so that kind of experience pretty much highlighted uh, how games like Pokemon Go somehow thinks of this hypermediacy in an ideal environment, where and usually from perspective of a white person, where their sense of mobility is sort of like freer than those from people of color. So that's how we discuss it in my class in terms of this like notion of hypermediacy and augmented reality. And I think the last one is about research, right? The future of research field. Well, personally, I'm optimistic with the development of global digital humanities or global media studies, post-colonial media studies. I've seen emerging scholars try to forge critical link between digital media studies with the questions of difference, like ethnic, race, gender, and also inequalities. For instance, Rupika Risam's work on post-colonial digital humanities, Radhika Gajala's work on cyberculture and the subaltern, and in the case of Indonesia, probably Madeline Lim is the most prominent scholar on Indonesian digital culture. So I guess, yeah, I mean, I'm sort of aligning with these scholars, and I see that there is a future for I'm optimistic with the future of global digital cultures and post-colonial media studies.
Thank you, Isula. Now I want to open it up to the audience for further questions. And as Dr. Schaefer said, we would like to hear from you. If you are okay with that, you can just, raise your hand like this and we'll call on you. Or you can write your question in the chat. We would prefer to hear your voices because we're all isolated nowadays. But if you prefer using the chat, that's fine.
Enrique, Grace Bonner has her hand up.
Yeah, go ahead, Grace.
I just had a question wondering about what's your advice to people who aren't necessarily video game players, but want to explore more of what you talked about, like post-colonial media and its effects?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think I would start probably with I would start probably with the library. In this case, there are a lot of post-colonial media work, I think, that scholars have done, and if you Google post-colonial media or post-colonial video games, you will, I mean, there will list will come up, and I think it's also good in this case to start from local, I guess, local activism or local original sort of like concern, because that then will get to kind of create a network to a larger network. I mean, that's how I started. I think in my case, so start from a local kind of local awareness, and then with that local awareness, then it will grow to a much more transnational and translocal awareness. And I mean, I play video games, but I play video games differently from my students. Let's just say that, because whenever I tell them about the games, they don't know. But if we talk about Call of Duty or like Fortnite, that's their area. So so I think it even in video game cultures, there seems to be a two kind of world. Like there is the world of the mainstream video game culture, and there is that other world that's tend to be neglected. I think to be aware of that world would be important in understanding about global video game cultures.
There's another question from Aaron Pedersen.
Yeah, so my question is how, as non-video game programmers, we can help with the decolonization of video games.
Mm-hmm. That's a really great question. I think, well, I cannot say support the video game developers because many of the games are actually free to play. So I guess maybe to play them and then to sort of like learn from your experience in playing them. Because like for instance, the Thunderbird strike, it's really interesting because it was accused by the local state government in Minnesota as promoting eco-terrorism. So so Elizabeth Lopansi was accused as promoting eco-terrorism because of the depiction in the game. But when I asked my student to play the game, they were kind of like, how come they accuse the game as like eco-terrorist? But there's nothing about eco-terrorism in the game itself if you play it. So I guess in that sense, I'm also sort of like relating it in the notion of moral panic around video games. Sometimes people think about video games and the negative effect of video games. Even in my home country, Indonesia, there is a fatwa, haram fatwa to play a certain video game, and I believe that probably they don't play it before they decide that it's haram. So I think at least to play them and to sort of like to be familiar with this game is one step to understand or to participate in this like decolonization of video games.
There's a question from Lou Barron, who has her hand up.
Yeah, so I was actually also kind of curious about the like two world thing of video games, because there is kind of this, mainstream, all of these like shooter things, but then there's also this whole like other world of radical games. And I'm kind of wondering if you ever see those two worlds coming together in any way, or if they're just always going to be kind of two separate realms, if that makes sense.
That's a really good question. There are initiatives to kind of like connect this together in many ways. And I think one example is this game, Never Alone. So Never Alone is a commercial game. It's actually not, it's not like activist game, but it's made actually by, it's considered the first game that's the first commercial game developed by indigenous game developer. It's made by in collaboration with the people from Inupiaq in Alaska, and the game is really beautiful. I really enjoyed playing it, and so that one example of trying to sort of like connect these two worlds. Sort of between this mainstream and this sort of like other independent or more like more critical a practice of video games. So, and I think what else? There are games. Some games fail also in trying to do this. There's this game called Detroit Becoming Human. So that's one example that tries to deal with race, the question of race, but some people think that they don't really necessarily handle it really well. But I guess I just learned too that well, next week, I think, I don't know if it's posted here. So next week there is a workshop co-organized by Global Digital Humanities, where I belong, and there's this one paper that discussed video games developers' perspective on digital activism. So it seems that there is this kind of a growing effort to sort of connect these two worlds. to sort of like in terms of like creating a game that deals critically with question of race and differences and like ethnicity, etc.
Thank you.
I think we have time only for one question. So let's do the following. Connor and Colleen, can you both ask your questions so that Isul can answer them together? Okay, Colleen, you were first. Yes, go ahead.
Well, my question is pretty similar to the last one. I was just wondering about like the AAA game industry, the really big publishers, stuff like Detroit Become Human. What steps specifically do you think that these game developers and publishers need to take to decolonize that world?
Mm-hmm.
And should I go? I'll ask mine. Do you think it's possible for post-colonial media games to thrive and make an impact in more simplistic and popular games like a Candy Crush type game? Or should these games like start out being more like long, lengthy narrative types of media?
Okay, that's really good question. Okay, so to answer the first one from Colleen, I think it is possible, but also it's difficult because in my class we discuss about video game industry, and I think I'm not sure if everybody's familiar with the term crunch time. So basically in video game industry, video game developers are familiar with crunch time, which is where they have to work like 24/7 for 6 days to finish their game. So it's really exploitative and farm. It's really exploitative industry in many ways. And also there is a kind of like a hierarchy between game developers and also quality controller, where quality controller considered as like at the low end within the industry, and then they don't get bonuses, they don't get invited to parties, and also they are hired in the subcontract mechanism, so they're not considered as a full-time workers. So within this kind of like structure in AAA game industry, it's really hard to kind of like have that kind of voice for decolonization or decolonizing games. Of course, it's not impossible, but just because of what it is right now, I think most of those who are concerned or who sort of like participate in this kind of like critical approach to video games, they choose the independent route. They choose the because it's much easier for them to sort of express their ideology, express their opinion. And for Connor, I think both are possible. I've seen simple games that try to sort of to have a critical approach about video game cultures, about there is this game, it's called September 11 by Gonzalo Frasca, and it's really simple, and I think, and the idea here, if you play it, you lose. So because it's about it's a reaction toward militarization post 9/11 and military expansion post 9/11 about terrorism. So the idea here is that if you play the game, you have to shoot, kill the terrorist with a missile, but every time you shoot the missile, you will kill civilians, and those civilians' relative will turn into terrorists. So you will never win the game. In the end, basically all the civilians will turn into terrorists. So that's
I'm going to have to interrupt you at this point, Izul, when you're saying that everyone turns into a terrorist, and suggest that we quickly move to having some takeaways. We like to end our events by inviting folks to say one thing that they are going to take away, one thing they learned this evening, something they'd like to share. So I'm happy to invite folks to unmute and give us some feedback, some takeaways to our conversation.
I'll start off by saying that I had a great time Googling your work at Hobart online, and so many PDFs are there for me to read tonight. I'm like, I'm sorry, I've got my reading list for the next 3 days. I've got to say, all you have to do is Google his name and you'll be reading for days. So thank you, Iskandar. I'm really happy that I found those things.
Thank you, Phil.
Yes, I agree. I have been looking at all the links and everything. I'm saving the chat links that were posted during the discussion to read. I managed to get a few in, but as a parent, as a takeaway, as a parent, I almost wish and think that these could almost be marketed, not in a gaming field, but more in a newspaper, current events type of market, as opposed to, I know they're video games, but it's a lesson learned. And how often do you have to play it to really learn the lesson?
That's really interesting, Maureen, because Ian Bogos actually has a book about news games. So that particularly deals about, I'm particularly concerned about what you just said.
Yeah, it's very, very, very interesting. Thank you so much for tonight.
Thank you, most welcome.
Good.
I guess kind of going off of what Phil was saying is I've never been particularly interested in playing video games because they're more like Call of Duty, I guess, is kind of the kind of thing I think about when I think of video games. But after this talk, I'm really interested to, I took some of the names down and some of the links, so I'm interested to look into these post-colonial media games and to play them to see, I guess, like just how they work, because they seem a lot more interesting to me. So I'm excited about that.
Thank you.
Hi, yes, this is Ragnar Peterson. I had, as one who looks at film and video games from an entertainment perspective, because it just takes me to some other place, the conversation tonight raised many questions, more than I could probably ask here. But one question would be, how does one find out of these new games that you guys are hearing about? And I know you can Google probably new games, but is there, a website you guys go to do this? Because some of them, just from someone who looks at gaming and film from a entertainment perspective, are there basic questions that you teach your students to ask while viewing or playing that would give insights on how to be more sensitive or empathetic within the different cultures?
I'm going to say that might be something, if you can stay with us in our sobremesa, we might be able to have a conversation about some resources. So if you want to hold on to that question, and we can hear from maybe 2 or 3 other people with takeaways. And then the sobremesa will begin in a minute or 2.
I guess I could go. Hello, Pak Zul. I'm also in an Indonesian, and I'm one of the participants for the workshop as well. And my focus is more, in HIV media in Indonesia, and I don't really look into the gaming kind of side of it. So I think I learned a lot about that. That it's kind of similar with what I've been investigating in film and mainstream media about how they represent HIV bodies, right? But now it's a more kind of like bigger picture of how post-coloniality is still kind of embedded in our culture. So thank you about that, Pat.
We want to thank everyone so much for coming to the conversation this evening. Let us all unmute ourselves and applaud for this evening's speakers.
Hey, Leah, we're here. It's sobremesa time.